Hey guys, let's take a step back in time. London, the winter of 1860. A city that usually prided itself on progress and empire, suddenly found itself gasping under the weight of something far more primitive cold. Not just the kind of chill that makes you shiver, but a bone-deep freeze that seeped into every wall, every breath, every street. Tonight, we're diving into what it meant to survive one of the harshest winters of the 19th century. When coal ran short, the streets froze solid, and even the mighty capital of Britain felt fragile. If you enjoy this journey through history, make sure to give the video a like and follow. It really helps us bring more stories like this to life. Now picture this: London, draped in fog and frost. The Thames sluggish under sheets of ice. Carriages moving cautiously over cobblestones, slick with frozen mud. From a distance, it could almost look beautiful, like a scene out of a snow globe. But step closer, and beauty gives way to brutality. Families lined up at coal yards before dawn, stamping their feet against the frost, breath curling into the air like ghosts. They weren't there by choice. They were there because coal was the difference between life and death, between a child drifting off to sleep or shivering until morning broke. Coal wasn't just fuel, it was survival. Without it, homes turned into tombs of frost. And in 1860, the supply chain broke down. Barges froze along the river. Demand soared while stockpiles dwindled. Prices shot up so high that even middle-class families hesitated before buying. For the poor, it was impossible. They carried baskets, sacks, sometimes just bare hands, hoping for a few lumps of coal. And when the gates at the yards opened, order dissolved into desperation. People pushed, shouted, even fought, not because they wanted more, but because they feared having nothing. Merchants didn't make things easier. Many hoarded coal, waiting for prices to peak. Warehouses held mountains of black fuel locked away, while the city outside froze. In wealthier neighborhoods, you could hear fires roaring behind thick curtains, drawing rooms glowing with warmth. Meanwhile, in Whitechapel or Southwark, a single ember had to be coaxed all night. Ashes sifted for unburned scraps, furniture legs broken and fed into the hearth. Imagine the smell: soot and damp wool, mingled with the acrid bite of burning leather, rope, or anything else desperate hands could find to burn. Inequality had always been part of London, but the cold made it impossible to ignore. The poor could see the glow of rich homes, the flicker of gas lamps burning steadily while their own candles sputtered. That divide stoked anger. Crowds gathered around coal carts, shouting when prices rose again. A sack that cost pennies now required shillings. Arguments spilled into fights. Police broke them up, batons flashing in the fog. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, as voices cracked the air sharper than the frost. The sound of the city, that winter, wasn't just wheels on ice. It was the rumble of people demanding fairness. And yet, hardship didn't erase humanity. In many neighborhoods, people shared what they had. One family brought a pot of thin broth, another a few scraps of coal, another some blankets. Fires became communal. Strangers sitting shoulder to shoulder, warming hands over the same meager flames. Songs were sung, not out of joy but defiance. Children laughed at shadows dancing on the wall, turning them into stories to forget their hunger for a while. That laughter, fragile as it was, mattered. Because in the face of cold, laughter itself was resistance. The newspapers reported on it. but words on paper couldn't capture the sting of frost that made fingers swell or the cough of a child sleeping under rags. They called it the Great Coal Crisis. They spoke of shortages, of the market, of weather patterns. But ask any mother who spent the night feeding scraps of wood into the fire, and she'd tell you it wasn't just about coal. It was about watching her child's lips turn blue and not knowing if the morning would come. The Thames became a cruel symbol. Barges frozen midstream, black cargo just out of reach, as if mocking the city. Some hoped the ice would thicken enough for a frost fair, like the old days when the frozen river became a carnival of hope. But the ice never grew strong enough. Instead, it creaked and groaned, reminding everyone that not even the river could be trusted. People walked to the banks just to stare, their breath fogging, their faces hollow. The river seemed to whisper. Survival would not come easily. Churches and charities stepped in. Soup kitchens ladled thin broth into tin cups. Coal tickets were handed out like lifelines, but demand was too great. The lines stretched long, men and women waiting hours in the snow for a few spoonfuls of soup or a small ration of coal. Some received nothing. Still, they queued, because even a chance at warmth was worth the wait. Sermons preached charity, urging the wealthy to give, and a few did, but generosity, like the coal itself, was scarce. What did families do when there was nothing left? They improvised. Ashes from old fires were sifted for unburned crumbs. Straw from mattresses was burned. Shoes, broken carts, wooden shutters, anything that could catch flame. The air of London filled with strange smells, each one telling a story. Burned leather meant someone had nothing left but an old boot. The scent of scorched rope meant another family had dismantled a cart. Every breath you took was a reminder of someone else's struggle. But the human spirit is a strange thing. In some of the darkest corners, where frost crept along the walls and hunger gnawed at every belly, resilience grew. Parents whispered stories to their children, not fairy tales of castles and knights, but tales of survival, of winters endured and better days promised. And those stories mattered. They gave children something to hold on to when the cold wanted to take everything. The frost still clung. The shortages dragged on. But Londoners had adapted. They wore every piece of clothing at once. They cooked meals in one pot to conserve fuel. They all slept in one room, bodies pressed together, turning human warmth into another kind of fire. And though tempers still flared at the yards, and inequality still burned hotter than any coal, there was also quiet dignity, because endurance itself became a kind of rebellion. The winter of 1860 exposed more than just bare fingers and frozen streets. It exposed the cracks in society, the cruelty of hoarding, and the resilience of community. It showed that power wasn't just in parliament or palaces, it was in neighbors sharing scraps, in mothers soothing children, in workers standing shoulder to shoulder demanding fairness. London survived, scarred but standing, and that survival told a story more enduring than frost. If you were walking the streets of London in that brutal winter of 1860, the first thing you'd notice wasn't the silence of snow or the glow of gas lamps, it was the faces. Pale, hollow, worn down by cold and hunger, every cheekbone looked sharper, every eye a little more sunken, and every cough echoed longer than it should. You could tell who had coal and who didn't, just by the way they stood. Those with fuel carried themselves upright, their coats steaming faintly with trapped warmth. Those without? They hunched into themselves, shoulders drawn tight, as if trying to hide from the frost clawing at their bones. The shortage wasn't just about cold, it was about time. Coal fires meant boiling water to wash, to cook, to clean wounds. Without it, even the smallest task stretched into an ordeal. Imagine mothers trying to scrub clothes in water so icy it burned their skin raw, fingers swelling and cracking until they bled. Or workers arriving at factories only to find that the machinery, stiffened by frost, wouldn't even start. Time froze along with the streets, and the children, London's children, bore the worst of it. Their breath came in clouds, their cheeks chapped red, noses raw from constant wiping on sleeves stiff with frost. Many carried slates to school, their chalk dust frozen in the air as they wrote. Teachers tried to press lessons through the shivers, their words punctuated by coughs, the whole room rattling with the sound of bodies fighting the cold. Have you ever tried to learn when your hands won't stop shaking? That was the daily reality. Education froze alongside the ink in its wells. Markets didn't escape the crisis either. Picture Smithfield, usually bustling with noise and movement, now subdued under a blanket of frost. Stalls displayed cabbages rimed with ice, potatoes hard as stones, bread so stiff it felt like wood. Sellers wrapped scarves around their mouths, voices muffled as they called out prices that no one could afford. The smell was no longer of food, but of coal dust and wet wool. People didn't come to shop with excitement. They came with desperation, with coins clenched tight in numb fingers, hoping that one crust of bread or one root vegetable would keep their family fed another day. The carters and milkmen pressed on, their horses stamping nervously on frozen cobbles. Hooves slipped, wheels creaked, and every trip became a gamble. How many times that winter did a cart overturn on icy streets, scattering bottles of milk or splintering crates of goods into the snow? Too many to count. And still, they kept going, because stopping wasn't an option. London was a city that couldn't pause, even when the weather demanded it. The fog made it worse. London's infamous pea soupers thickened with the winter freeze until it felt like you could scoop the air with a spoon. Visibility shrank to a few feet. Gas lamps glowed as halos, useless beyond arm's length. People moved cautiously, boots crunching, hands brushing walls to keep from losing their way. And inside that fog, the city felt smaller, more claustrophobic, as if the frost was slowly closing its fist around every street and alley. And then there was the tension. The poor had always lived close to the edge, but in 1860, the edge became a cliff. Coal riots broke out in some districts. Crowds stormed coal yards, shouting for fair prices, clashing with police. Imagine the scene. Fog so thick you can barely see. The glow of lanterns swaying, shouts rising, boots pounding, batons cracking against frozen air. Desperation doesn't stay quiet forever. When survival is on the line, even the most docile can turn fierce. But even in the harshest corners, Londoners proved inventive. Some turned to peat, digging it from marshes outside the city. Others gathered scraps of wood from construction sites, breaking down fences, stealing crates. Chimneys smoked with strange fuels, animal bones, tar-soaked rope, even bits of old furniture. The city stank of survival. It wasn't the familiar coal smoke of London. It was a bitter cocktail of anything that would burn. At night, When families huddled together, every ember mattered. Mothers blew gently on ashes, coaxing a faint glow into flame. Fathers broke chairs or tore shutters from windows to keep fires alive. Children lay so close to the hearth, their hair smelled permanently of smoke. And still the cold pressed in, relentless, seeping through bricks, gnawing at toes and fingers, whispering in every draft. And yet, amid that cruelty, the city had its fragile moments of grace. A neighbor sharing a candle, a stranger pressing a lump of coal into another's hand, a baker slipping a child a crust too stale to sell. These weren't grand acts, they were flickers of humanity, small enough to be overlooked but powerful enough to keep hope alive. Because when survival becomes the measure of every day, kindness itself becomes a revolution. That winter didn't just freeze the major streets. It froze time, froze tempers, froze the illusion that London was invincible. It showed just how close a city, no matter how grand, could come to unraveling when its lifeblood coal was cut off. And for the families who lived through it, the memory of frost and fog and hunger would linger long after the ice finally thawed. By mid-January of 1860, London felt like a city trapped inside a snow globe, shaken, unsettled, and sealed in by its own ice. The frost didn't just paint pretty patterns on windows. It cracked pipes, froze pumps, and turned every daily task into a fight against nature. Imagine trying to draw water in the morning, only to find the pump handle stiff as iron, the spout dribbling nothing but shards of ice. Housewives stood in line with buckets, breath steaming, knocking at frozen pumps as if persistence alone could melt the frost. Coal, already scarce, now felt like treasure. The wealthier households hoarded their stocks, burning steadily, their chimneys puffing warm plumes into the frozen fog. In contrast, poorer families scraped together whatever they could. A few lumps of coal, carefully rationed, bits of wood scavenged from alleys, some burned dried dung, others shredded old clothes for fuel. The smell drifting through narrow streets was a strange mix, coal smoke laced with sour notes of burning rags and bone. London didn't smell like a city anymore. It smelled like survival. At the docks, barges carrying coal sat trapped behind ice floes on the Thames. Men with poles and axes tried to break the frozen edges, their shouts echoing through the mist. But the river wasn't giving way. Each crack of ice was followed by silence, as though the Thames itself mocked their efforts. Without the coal, warehouses sat empty, yards stood quiet, and the queue outside every coal merchant stretched further each day. Mothers with babies on their hips stamped their feet against the frozen ground, praying their coins would be enough when their turn came. And yet, there were moments when the city tried to keep its spirit alive. Churches opened their doors to the poor, letting bodies warm by flickering candlelight. Soup kitchens ladled out thin broth, more water than meat, but enough to take the edge off gnawing hunger. Do you know what hope tastes like? In that winter, it tasted like cabbage soup, smoky and thin, eaten slowly so it lasted longer. Street life took on a strange rhythm. Carriages creaked along cautiously, wheels screeching against icy cobbles. Horses slipped, their hooves sparking against stone, breath billowing in clouds. Children, too restless to stay indoors, slid on frozen puddles, their laughter brief and brittle in the cold air. Even play carried risk. One fall could mean illness, and in those days, Sickness wasn't a visitor easily sent away. Factories were no refuge. Without enough coal, machines stood silent, work slowed, and wages shrank. Men gathered outside workshops, stamping their feet, hands jammed deep into pockets, waiting for foremen to decide if the day would bring work or another long walk home with empty hands. For families already on the edge, each missed wage was another nail in the coffin of winter survival. And yet, London endured. Neighbors shared scraps, bakers slipped stale bread to hungry children, and strangers offered nods of solidarity in the fog. In alleys and markets, the talk turned constantly to weather. Will the frost break? Will the river thaw? It was less conversation than prayer. A chant passed from mouth to mouth, as if repeating the words might summon a warmer Sunday. At night, when the city settled into its eerie hush, the smallest gestures mattered most. A father stoking embers one more time. A mother tucking children so tightly beneath blankets that they disappeared from sight. A neighbor knocking gently to ask if a candle could be spared. These weren't dramatic acts of heroism. They were quiet, steady choices that said, "We will not let the frost take everything." London's winter of 1860 wasn't remembered for snowmen or picturesque streets. It was remembered for its hunger, its coal riots, its frostbitten hands, and its endless, bone-deep cold. But it was also remembered for resilience. Because even in a city where the river froze, where pumps ran dry, and where bread turned hard as stone, the people of London, ordinary, weary, stubborn, kept moving forward, step by step, breath by breath, ember by ember. As January dragged on, desperation in London's poorest districts reached a breaking point. The coal shortages weren't just an inconvenience anymore. They became a spark for unrest. Picture lines outside coal yards stretching longer than a city block, people stamping their frozen feet, clutching coins so tight their knuckles turned white. Mothers held thin shawls tighter around their children, whispering prayers that today they'd go home with at least a small sack. But when the gates closed early and supplies ran out, the murmur of the crowd hardened into anger. In Whitechapel and Southwark, scuffles broke out. A cart carrying coal through the streets was stopped by a mob, its load scattered and grabbed by desperate hands. Police rushed in, their whistles piercing the frozen air. But how do you stop a crowd driven by hunger and cold? Some said it wasn't theft, it was survival. After all, how long can you watch your children's lips turn blue before you do something about it? Newspapers of the time recorded these tensions with a mix of sympathy and fear. Disturbances at the coal yards, one headline read. Another warned of disorder in the markets. But behind those tidy words were scenes of real struggle, families clawing for scraps of warmth, fathers willing to risk prison for a single sack of coal. Meanwhile, the streets themselves told their own story. The fog thickened, hanging low like a gray curtain, swallowing up lamplight, until even familiar alleys felt strange. Snow drifted in slow, heavy flakes, layering roofs and cobbles until the city looked quiet, almost beautiful. But beauty in those days was cruel. Behind frosted windows, families sat with empty hearths, their breath fogging the air indoors. The silence wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. Markets shrank as supplies dwindled. Bread was hard, potatoes shriveled, and meat nearly vanished from stalls. Vendors shouted their wares with cracked voices, the cold biting into their throats. Children, wide-eyed and hungry, gazed at roasted chestnuts or steaming pies they could never afford. Sometimes a kind hand slipped them a scrap, but kindness alone couldn't fill stomachs. And yet, Londoners clung to rituals that reminded them they were still human. Church bells still rang, muffled through the fog, their tones heavy but steady. Neighbors knocked on each other's doors, not just to borrow, but simply to ask, "Are you all right?" A single candle shared, a bit of broth divided, a log split in half. These small gestures stitched the city together when the frost tried to tear it apart. At night, the city became eerily still. Boots crunched on icy streets, carriage wheels squealed against frozen stone, and from time to time, a watchman's lantern flickered in the fog. The Thames lay silent, ice clinging to its edges like claws. Some whispered it would freeze solid, like in the great frost fairs of old. But few had the energy for fantasies. Survival left little room for romance. Inside the narrow homes of the working poor, families curled together like nests of sparrows. Fires, if they burned at all, were coaxed from a few splinters of wood or the last crumbs of coal. Blankets layered over coats, coats layered over shawls, and still the cold seeped in. And yet, in the hush of those nights, voices carried songs, sung in whispers, old stories retold, anything to keep children's minds from the emptiness in their bellies. This was the brutal truth of London's winter in 1860. Not just the cold, not just the shortages, but the grinding, endless endurance. Every day was a question. How much longer can we hold on? And every night, somehow, the answer was, one more. The brutal winter didn't just squeeze families inside their homes. It bled into every corner of work. Factories, workshops, and laundry yards became battlegrounds against the cold. Imagine standing in a drafty mill where windows frosted over on the inside. Machines rattled so loudly you couldn't hear your own thoughts, and the damp air stung every cut on your hands. Workers wrapped rags around their fingers just to keep them moving, but even so, frost bit through the cloth. Iron workers in Southwark struck their hammers against frozen metal, sparks flashing briefly before vanishing into gray air. Each strike echoed through the fog like a cry for survival. The men's breath rose in clouds, mixing with smoke and soot, and when they paused to wipe their faces, their scarves came away blackened. Yet wages stayed low, hours stayed long, and bosses reminded them that 100 other men would take their place if they faltered. Washerwomen had it just as bad, maybe worse. Picture them bent over buckets filled with water that froze at the edges within minutes. They scrubbed linen against boards until their knuckles cracked and bled. Steam from the icy water rose in pale clouds, but it offered no warmth. Their backs ached, their arms shook, and yet they kept going because if the washing didn't get done, the pennies didn't come. And pennies meant coal, bread, maybe milk if they were lucky. Children weren't spared either. Some ran errands through icy alleys, their thin coats no match for the biting wind. Others scavenged wood scraps from construction sites or picked up lumps of coal fallen near rail yards, treasures to bring home for the fire. Boots slipped on cobbles, cheeks burned red by frost, but laughter still managed to break through, sometimes sharp, fleeting, but real. That laughter, thin as it was, became a reminder that even in the worst cold, childhood refused to die completely. By midday, London's streets filled with these layers of struggle. Carters urged weary horses through icy ruts, their voices hoarse from shouting into the fog. Horses themselves stood steaming, ribs sharp under hides, nostrils flaring as they strained against loads twice as heavy in the frost. Street sellers called out, "Hot pies, chestnuts, candles," but their voices cracked with cold, and their baskets grew lighter by the hour. And yet, life didn't stop. It never did. Tools rang in workshops, looms clattered in dim rooms where fingers bled on frozen threads, and the faint sound of church bells cut through the fog as if to remind everyone, time still marched forward. What choice did they have but to march with it? Inside the poorest homes, the exhaustion of work seeped into every corner. Men came back with hands blistered and raw, clothes stiff with frost. Women returned with arms trembling from the weight of buckets, their skirts soaked at the hems from icy water. Children stumbled in, faces raw, fingers stiff, clutching whatever scraps they had managed to find. And yet, when they all collapsed near the hearth, however small the fire, there was a strange comfort in simply being together. The air inside these rooms was thick with survival. Coal smoke, damp wool, the sharp tang of soap, the faint sweetness of stale bread. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't even comfort in the usual sense. But it was life. And in the bitter winter of 1860, life itself felt like victory. As the day wore on, the cold pressed harder, and people drifted toward the markets, those noisy arteries of the city that even frost couldn't quite silence. But in December of 1860, the markets weren't bustling with abundance. They were heavy with desperation. Picture Covent Garden or Spitalfields in the pale afternoon light. Stalls lined the arcades, their canvas tops, stiff with frost, edges crusted in ice. The usual cries of "potatoes, apples, fresh fish" sounded muted, as if the vendors themselves had lost their breath to the cold. Apples shriveled in their baskets, skins wrinkled like old leather, root vegetables sagged, frostbitten and limp. And fish once hauled fresh from coastal boats arrived stiff as boards, their eyes glazed white with ice. Families shuffled between stalls with coins clutched tightly, every purchase weighed like a matter of survival. Do we buy bread? Or a few turnips? A bit of dripping fat? Or a candle to make the night less dark? Mothers bargained quietly, their voices trembling, while fathers stood with jaws clenched, the weight of decision heavy on their shoulders. Children's eyes followed steaming cones of roasted chestnuts or golden pies stacked in rows, but their stomachs tightened as they walked on empty-handed. And yet sometimes kindness flickered, like sparks in the gloom. A baker, seeing a child staring too long, might slip a stale roll into her hand. A fishmonger might toss in an extra bone for broth when he noticed a mother's shawl patched beyond repair. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, almost secret acts of generosity. But in a winter like this, they meant everything. They turned despair into endurance. By late afternoon, the market thinned. Stalls closed early, vendors eager to retreat to their own small fires. The sound of carts rattling away over icy cobbles filled the gray air. And when the last cries faded, the squares stood nearly silent, scattered with bruised turnips, broken crates, and frost-covered straw. Above, crows circled and cawed in the dim light, their wings black against a pale, sinking sky. London seemed to exhale as darkness returned. Gas lamps sputtered to life, halos trembling in the fog. Shadows stretched across deserted stalls. Families carried their small treasures home, perhaps a loaf of bread, perhaps nothing at all, moving carefully through slippery streets, their breaths rising like pale ghosts. And in those quiet hours, hunger was sharper than the wind. But in the memory of a free roll or an extra scrap of bone, there was a fragile hope, a reminder that even when survival felt like a losing battle, the city still held space for mercy. The streets emptied after the markets closed, but London wasn't silent. Not yet. The heartbeat of the city still pulsed along the river. If the markets were the stomach, then the Thames was the spine. It carried goods, coal, and fish into the heart of the capital. But in the winter of 1860, even the great river seemed shackled by frost. Along the embankments, the fog was so thick it felt alive. It crawled across the water like a living blanket, muffling sound and swallowing light. Bargemen moved like shadows, their silhouettes half hidden in the mist. Each step along the icy planks creaked like bones under strain. Their boots slipped on boards glazed with ice. Ropes burned raw into their hands, and every crate they lifted felt twice as heavy in the freezing damp. Imagine standing there, the sting of brine in the air, the sour tang of waste washed down from the city, the sharp bite of coal smoke drifting from chimneys. Everything smelled of cold, smoke, and damp earth. Every breath cut like glass in your lungs. Would you last long in that? The Thames itself was no gentle friend. Ice gathered at its edges, jagged as broken glass. Shards clinked together as they drifted downstream, making a sound like shattered porcelain. Some men joked it sounded like the river was breaking its own teeth. But beneath the jokes lay fear, because everyone knew if the Thames froze completely, if barges could no longer move, coal shipments would stop altogether. And if coal stopped, so would the fires that kept London alive. Dockworkers muttered about it as they stamped their boots for warmth. They spoke of shipments stranded upriver, caught in ice, their cargo delayed for weeks. "No boats means no pay," one man grumbled, his breath clouding thick in the air. And no pay meant empty hearths at home. Hunger wasn't just gnawing in bellies. It was waiting in the shadows, ready to claim whoever faltered. Children gathered at the riverbanks too. They didn't understand the economics of it, but they knew the sight was strange. Great sheets of ice drifted by, shimmering pale under the dim winter Sunday. They dreamed of skating across it, as their grandparents had told them of frost fairs long ago, when the river froze solid and Londoners danced and drank ale on its back. But their parents frowned, shaking their heads. They remembered what those old freezes really meant: famine, sickness, death. Still, the children played their little games. They tossed pebbles onto drifting shards, watching them wobble and spin. They made rhymes about gingerbread stalls on frozen water, songs so light they almost disguised the heaviness around them. Isn't that something? How children can turn even hunger into play, even danger into wonder. But the grown men saw the Thames differently. To them, it was a warning. Each crack of splitting ice rang out like a gunshot, echoing across the fog. It reminded them how fragile everything was, how a single season of frost could break the supply chain of an empire. And London, mighty as it seemed, was never more vulnerable than when it was cold. Night along the river was another kind of world. The fog thickened until lamps looked like floating orbs halos trembling in the mist. A barge horn moaned through the darkness, low and mournful, like some ancient creature trapped beneath the ice. The sound vibrated through the fog, rolling over rooftops, rattling the shutters of nearby homes. If you heard it while lying in bed, you might swear it was the city itself crying out. Families near the riverbanks lived half with fear and half with hope. On good nights, when shipments broke through the ice, they could see the barges crawling slowly past, lanterns swinging dimly from their bows. It meant coal. It meant warmth. But on bad nights, when the river was still and silent, only the ice moving sluggishly beneath the fog, it meant another day of nothing. Imagine being a child in those homes, pulling at your mother's sleeve, asking if the coal boats would come tomorrow, and she would smile, maybe, even when she didn't believe it herself. She would tell you yes, of course, the boats would come. Because hope, even when it was thin as smoke, was something you couldn't ration. There were other rhythms along the Thames, too. Fishermen, wrapped in heavy coats, cast their lines into sluggish water, more out of habit than expectation. Their baskets came up empty more often than not, but they kept at it, because what else could they do? Some carried lanterns that flickered faintly in the mist, their reflections trembling in the black water like stars fallen into the river. The creak of mooring posts, the groan of ropes stiff with frost, the splash of oars breaking through thin ice. These were the sounds of survival. Each one carried weight. Each one was proof that London hadn't stopped. Not yet. Further up the river, near the bridges, children stood wide-eyed, pointing at icicles that hung from the arches like crystal daggers. They glimmered faintly in the lamplight, beautiful but deadly. If one broke loose, it could spear down like a knife. But still, the children laughed, their voices sharp and bright against the muffled night. Isn't that strange? Even in the coldest times, laughter could still cut through. At the docks, taverns offered fleeting warmth. Bargemen crowded inside, their boots leaving muddy slush across the floors, their breath steaming in the haze of smoke and spilled ale. They spoke of ice, of coal shortages, of children coughing in damp homes. Some cursed the city authorities, blaming them for failing to stockpile enough fuel. Others simply shrugged. What could the government do against weather? Against the very sky itself? And then they drank, because the ale, even watered down, burned in their throats and gave them the illusion of warmth. For an hour or two, the world outside seemed less sharp, but the frost always waited. When they stepped back out, it greeted them with open arms, biting at their cheeks, numbing their fingers, reminding them who was truly in charge. Meanwhile, the Thames itself kept breathing. Beneath the fog, beneath the ice, the current still moved. It carried whispers of resilience, of persistence, and those who lived beside it felt that rhythm deep in their bones. Because no matter how harsh the winter, the river never stopped. It slowed, it cracked, it groaned, but it never stopped. And maybe that was the lesson for Londoners in that brutal winter. You endure, you groan, you crack, you carry the weight of ice and scarcity, but you keep moving. Even if only beneath the surface, even if nobody else sees it, you keep moving. Factories did not stop for winter. They couldn't. The city's lifeblood depended on the rhythm of hammer, loom, and saw. And so, in December of 1860, while frost gripped the streets and coal smoke hung low in the fog, London's workshops kept their doors open, their windows glowing faintly with a weak amber light. But inside, life was no warmer than the bitter world beyond. Step through the door of a textile mill in Whitechapel or Southwark, and you would find air thick with damp. Every breath showed itself as mist, curling up into rafters dark with soot. The looms rattled endlessly, their wooden frames creaking like bones under strain. The rhythm was fast, almost frantic, but the workers moved more slowly, stiff from the cold, fingers raw and bleeding from thread that cut deeper in winter's air. Children worked there too thin, pale, with scarves wrapped around their mouths to keep out the dust. They ran between machines, hauling bobbins, feeding spindles, their boots slipping on floors slick with frost where water had frozen overnight. You might ask yourself, how could such small bodies endure such long hours? But they did, because their families depended on the few pennies they earned. In the ironworks, the contrast was brutal. The air was freezing near the doors, yet blistering by the furnaces. Sparks burst like stars whenever hammers struck iron, scattering light that glowed orange against walls streaked with frost. Men wiped sweat from their brows even as their breath came out in clouds. They swung hammers with numbed arms, their bodies steaming in the frigid air, the sound echoing like cannon fire through the frozen city streets. The smell of oil, smoke, and sweat filled these places, a pungent perfume of survival. The clatter of saws, the crash of metal, the groan of wooden beams created a music all its own, London's winter symphony of labor. But beneath it was a quieter truth. Every worker felt the cold in their bones, no matter how hot the machines roared. Street sellers passed by workshop doors, calling out goods, hot pies, roasted chestnuts, candles, their voices thin and wavering, swallowed quickly by the fog. Few workers could spare a coin, but the smell of chestnuts drifting in through cracks was enough to make mouths water. Hunger was not just at home. It followed men and women into their shifts, sat beside them on the benches, and tugged at their stomachs while their hands kept moving. Inside the workshops, tools themselves betrayed the season. Handles stiffened with frost, iron bits froze to gloved hands. Even leather straps grew brittle, snapping without warning. Each failure meant another hour of work, another danger to dodge. Yet no one complained loudly. Complaints did not keep coal in the scuttle or bread on the table. Instead, men grunted, women kept their heads low, and children worked silently until their legs trembled. By midday, windows were rimmed with frost, so thick it dimmed the weak winter light. Breath hung in the air, mingling with dust, turning the room into a haze where faces looked half like ghosts. A sneeze or cough echoed loudly, drawing worried glances. Sickness spread easily in these tight, frozen spaces. A single fever could sweep through a row of looms like fire through straw. And yet, in all this hardship, there were small flickers of defiance. A worker might hum a tune, barely audible beneath the roar of machinery. A boy might carve his initials into a beam with a scrap of metal, leaving behind proof that he had been there. A girl might share half of her crust of bread with a friend, both chewing slowly, pretending it filled more than it did. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of survival. Factories ended their shifts with tired bodies pouring into streets dark long before supper. Workers clutched their coats, scarves, or simply wrapped arms around themselves as they trudged home through icy alleys. Their breath mingled with the fog, their boots scuffed frost into powder, and their faces looked older than their years. But even in that, there was a rhythm of resilience, thousands moving in unison, keeping London alive one frozen day at a time. And as they walked, the city seemed to groan with them. Wooden beams cracked under frost. Icicles dripped onto cobblestones. Gas lamps flickered against the wind. The whole city was a machine of endurance, and its workers were the gears. Every clang, every cough, every footstep became part of London's great, grinding winter song. When the factory doors finally closed and the last hammer fell silent, the true battle began not with machines, but with the night. London's workers spilled into streets that were more ice than stone, their footsteps hollow against the frozen cobbles. Gas lamps glowed, faintly, halos trembling in the fog, but they did little to pierce the darkness of alleys where the poor made their homes. The East End was a maze of narrow lanes, tenements leaning against one another like tired men. Windows leaked yellow light through cracks in shutters, while smoke from small stoves curled weakly upward, swallowed by the fog before it reached the rooftops. The smell of coal smoke, damp wood, and boiled cabbage filled the air, a poor man's perfume that lingered on clothes, in hair, and even in dreams. Inside those cramped rooms, life was measured in layers. Layers of blankets, layers of smoke, layers of breath frozen in the air. Families huddled together, pressing close on straw pallets or thin mattresses, their bodies their only source of real heat. A single coal fire might glow in the corner, its embers coaxed carefully to last through the night. Every log, every lump of coal was rationed like treasure. Meals were modest to the point of sorrow. A pot of stew, stretched thin with more water than meat, sat on many tables. Bread was often stale, broken into smaller pieces so each child could hold something in their hands. Tea, weak and bitter, gave the illusion of warmth. Mothers stirred pots with deliberate slowness, as if time itself could thicken broth, while fathers tore bread into careful slices, ensuring no crumb was wasted. The cold was merciless indoors. Frost crept along window panes like veins of glass. Drafts slid through gaps in floorboards, chilling feet until toes went numb. Even blankets were stiff with damp, smelling of smoke and sweat. Yet within these hardships, families clung to rituals that gave shape to survival. A mother might smooth her child's hair before bed. A father might tell a short story about better days, and children whispered to each other under covers, their giggles a defiant spark against the frost. Beyond the walls, the city never slept entirely. Night watchmen patrolled with lanterns that swayed in the fog, their footsteps echoing along silent alleys. Vendors still lingered at corners, calling out the last of their chestnuts or pies, their voices hoarse and desperate. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a carriage wheel cracked against the ice, sending a sharp report through the night air. In taverns tucked into side streets, men warmed their hands over tankards of ale, their breath steaming as they spoke in low tones about wages, about landlords, about the price of coal rising faster than their pay. Some sang songs, voices rough but steady, carrying old tunes of sailors, soldiers, and rebels. The sound spilled into the street when doors opened, a sudden burst of warmth and life, quickly swallowed by fog. And yet, for every tavern glow, there were 10 homes sitting dark, their inhabitants choosing sleep over fire, silence over conversation, simply to conserve strength. Children curled beside one another like puppies. Mothers lay awake listening to the rattle of shutters in the wind. Fathers stared at the embers until their eyes burned, calculating whether the coal would last until morning. It was in these hours, when the fog grew thickest and the cold deepest, that London revealed its two faces most clearly. In the west, mansions glowed with chandeliers. Fires crackled in every room, and banquets were served without thought of scarcity. In the east, a single candle might stand against the dark, its wick trembling as though it knew the weight it carried. Still, life went on. Against the brutal winter of 1860, London's poor found ways to endure through closeness, through small kindnesses, through the stubborn belief that tomorrow might be gentler. And in their silent struggle, the city's pulse continued, steady and unyielding, echoing in every frostbitten street and smoky room. The deeper the night grew, the more London's alleys came alive, not with laughter or music, but with shadows. Fog clung to every corner, a silver curtain that blurred friend from foe. Gas lamps glimmered weakly, their halos too fragile to keep darkness at bay. In those murky streets, survival took on another form: cunning, desperation, and sometimes violence. Thieves prowled like ghosts. Some were boys no older than 12, thin as fence posts, eyes darting beneath ragged caps. Hunger was their weapon, and they wielded it without hesitation. A man clutching a loaf of bread or a few lumps of coal might find himself suddenly lighter, his prize snatched away into the mist. Others moved in pairs, older and rougher, knives hidden in sleeves, waiting near tavern doors for drunken men with jingling pockets. Police patrols wandered with lanterns swinging, their heavy boots crunching over icy cobblestones. But even their presence brought little comfort. The fog swallowed their shouts, and in narrow alleys where shadows multiplied, the law was often a step too late. Many Londoners chose routes home carefully, hugging main streets when possible, quickening their steps when footsteps echoed too closely behind. But crime was not only the work of strangers. Sometimes neighbors, driven by hunger, turned on each other. Coal bins were raided in the night, firewood stacks disappeared, and even washing lines sagged emptier in the morning. It was said that in the hardest weeks of the winter, bread went missing straight from windowsills as it cooled, snatched by hands too quick to catch. How many thefts were born of greed, and how many of pure survival? That was the question Londoners rarely dared to ask. And yet, not all shadows hid malice. In the same alleys where danger lurked, there were also bonds of solidarity. A widow might find a small bundle of kindling left at her door. A child, thin and shivering, might be handed a crust of bread by a stranger who had little more themselves. These quiet gestures, invisible in the fog, kept hope alive just as much as the small fires that glowed in tenement rooms. Meanwhile, taverns remained islands of heat in the frozen city. Their windows glowed amber, spilling music and drunken voices into the night. Inside, men forgot the cold for an hour or two, mugs of ale warming their hands and loosening their tongues. But even here, the winter crept in. Fights broke out over debts unpaid or insults thrown, and many left with bruises, stepping back into streets colder than before. On the riverbanks, the Thames groaned under its icy crust. Barges creaked in their moorings, and the air smelled of salt, smoke, and decay. Men working along the docks wrapped themselves in rags, their breath pluming in pale clouds, their hands raw and cracked from frost. They moved cautiously, for the ice made every plank treacherous. The river, like the city itself, gave no mercy in this winter. London's nights in 1860 were a paradox. Silence broken by sudden violence, stillness pierced by desperate cries, darkness softened by fleeting kindness. It was a place where the line between survival and crime blurred, where hunger could drive both theft and generosity. Every street corner held a story, every shadow a possibility, every breath in the icy fog a reminder of the fragile thread by which life hung. And yet, through all of it, the city endured. Its people endured. Against the freezing streets, the empty stomachs, and the lurking dangers, London's poor carried forward, one night at a time, resilient, watchful, and unyielding, their lives woven into the very fog that cloaked the city. When dawn finally pried open the fog, London's streets stirred to life, not with warmth, but with struggle. The markets of the city, half buried in frost, became the beating heart of survival. Here, in the biting air, every voice, every bargain, every clang of a cartwheel carried the sound of persistence. At Covent Garden, stalls lined the streets with their meager offerings. Vegetables lay stiff with ice, cabbages pale and brittle, potatoes dusted in frost. Vendors stamped their feet to keep blood flowing, their breath rising in thick clouds as they shouted prices that few could afford. A woman with cracked hands displayed onions wrapped in rags to keep them from freezing solid. Another cradled a basket of carrots as though guarding treasure. Coal merchants barked the loudest, their carts piled with black lumps that shimmered faintly in the weak morning light. But the price was cruel. Each sack cost nearly a week's wages for a laborer, and even then, the coal was often mixed with stone and dust. Buyers cursed but still paid, because without coal, there was no fire, and without fire, there was no survival. Have you ever seen people haggle not for luxury, but for the right to feel their fingers again? That was the London market in the winter of 1860. Street hawkers moved among the crowds, their cries cutting through the mist. A boy no older than 10 shouted, "Hot chestnuts! Hot chestnuts!" his basket steaming in the icy air. The nuts were meager, a handful at best, but for a penny they offered warmth that lingered on the tongue longer than in the stomach. Another man carried trays of pies, the crusts cracked from frost, the filling often little more than scraps of meat and gravy. He shouted promises of meat for your bones, though most knew better than to ask what kind of meat it truly was. Women, too, braved the streets, balancing trays of apples or ribbons or second-hand gloves. Their skirts were damp from slush, hems stiff with ice. They smiled with forced cheer, calling to passers-by, though behind the smiles lay exhaustion. Every sale was survival. A pair of gloves could mean food for a day. A handful of apples might keep the landlord's knock at bay for one more week. Children roamed the markets as well, not to buy, but to beg. Thin voices rose amid the clamor. "Spare a farthing, sir? Just a bit of bread, ma'am?" Many were orphans of cholera or typhus, bundled in rags, bare toes peeking through shoes long worn to tatters. Some tugged at sleeves, others simply waited with wide, hollow eyes. And sometimes a vendor would slip them a bruised apple or a crust too stale to sell, a gesture small but life-saving. The sounds of the market were a symphony of endurance. coins clinking, voices bargaining, carts creaking over icy cobblestones. The smells mixed into a strange brew coal smoke, roasting chestnuts, fish gone sour, and the faint sweetness of bread. It was not pleasant, but it was unmistakably alive. In a city where many homes held only silence and hunger, the market's noise was a reminder that life still pulsed. Yet behind the bustle lay the harsh truth: not everyone could buy. Many walked the stalls only to look, their pockets empty, their breath fogging in the cold as they drifted from cart to cart like ghosts. They watched others exchange coins, inhaled the scent of food they could not taste, and returned home with nothing but the memory of it. For them, markets were both salvation and torment, a stage where survival played out in plain sight, and poverty stood exposed for all to see. Still, even in these markets, moments of strange beauty flickered. Snow dusted the stalls like lace, icicles clung to wooden beams, and the glow of gas lamps made the frost sparkle like jewels. Children chasing each other between carts left trails of laughter in the mist. A fiddler stood on the corner, bow dancing across strings, his music trembling but determined, filling the air with a tune that reminded everyone that joy, however small, could still be claimed. This was London's winter market, harsh, raw, unyielding, but alive. Against the cold, against hunger, against despair, people gathered, traded, begged, and endured. The streets were unforgiving, the frost relentless, yet the markets whispered a simple truth: life, no matter how fragile, refuses to stand still. Beyond the noisy markets, where survival was bartered coin by coin, another rhythm echoed through London, the grind of its factories. The winter of 1860 was not only a season of hunger, it was a season of endless work. For thousands of men, women, and children, warmth did not come from the hearth, but from the choking heat of machinery, where fire and frost collided. In the textile mills, long rows of looms clattered without pause. Workers wrapped scarves around their mouths, not for fashion, but to filter the lint-filled air that clawed at their lungs. The cold seeped through brick walls, nipping at fingers, yet the iron gears demanded speed. Women's hands bled from thread cuts, men coughed into sleeves darkened with soot, and children darted under machines to gather scraps, their bare feet pressing against icy floors. One misstep, one moment of fatigue, and the machine swallowed more than fabric. Coal shortages made even these factories shiver. Owners rationed fuel, leaving furnaces barely smoldering. Workers wore layers of wool and patched cloth, but frost still clung to beams overhead. Imagine laboring 12 hours straight, your breath fogging in front of you, while the roar of iron drowned out every thought. The paycheck at the end of the week was survival, but it was meager, already swallowed by rent and the inflated cost of coal. Not far away, the docks groaned under winter's grip. The Thames lay stiff with ice along its edges, slowing barges and freezing ropes into stiff coils. Dock workers swung hammers with numbed hands, their bodies hunched against biting winds. Crates of coal and grain arrived late, sometimes spoiled by frost, and every delay meant more hunger in the city. The men shouted through scarves, voices muffled, muscles straining against loads that felt twice as heavy in the cold. In the foundries, where iron was poured and molded, the contrast was brutal. Near the furnace, heat scorched faces red, sweat dripping, even as snow fell outside. But step just a few feet away, and the cold slammed back in, turning damp clothing stiff as boards. Workers lived between extremes: fire that burned skin raw, and frost that gnawed at bones. The constant swing between heat and chill carved sickness into their lungs, leaving many coughing blood before winter's end. Women endured equally merciless conditions. In laundries, steam froze on windows, dripping back as icy rivulets onto the workers below. They scrubbed clothes in near-freezing water until their knuckles cracked and bled. In match factories, the air was thick with phosphorus fumes, making teeth rot and bones ache. Yet the workers pressed on, fingers trembling from both poison and cold. For many, a day's wage was not a choice. It was the only barrier between their children and starvation. And then there were the children, small bodies swallowed in oversized coats, trudging to workshops before dawn. They swept floors, hauled buckets, polished shoes, or fetched coal too heavy for their frames. Their cheeks burned red in the wind, their eyes half shut from exhaustion. Some sang songs to keep their spirits alive, high, thin voices rising above the grind of machines. Have you ever wondered how a child could laugh in the middle of such hardship? In 1860, that laugh was less joy, more defiance. Factories became prisons of necessity, places where London's poorest traded health for survival. The clang of metal, the thrum of looms, the rasp of saws, these were the city's heartbeat. Outside, the snow muted everything, but inside, the noise was relentless, a cruel reminder that work never paused for winter. Even sickness could not excuse absence. Miss a day, and wages were docked. Miss too many, and the job was gone. Yet even here, in the bleakness of iron and coal, sparks of humanity persisted. Workers shared scraps of bread, warming them on hot pipes. Women tucked shawls around coughing children. Men whistled tunes as hammers fell, trying to drown the roar with rhythm. And sometimes, in the brief pause between shifts, the factory floor fell quiet, and a kind of fragile peace hung in the cold, a reminder that even machines could not fully erase the human spirit. This was London's other market in the brutal winter of 1860. Not stalls and cries, but sweat and steel. Survival was not just bought, it was earned, with hands cracked, lungs scarred, and backs bent beneath the weight of both labor and frost. When the factory whistles fell silent and the last carts rattled back to stables, London's streets revealed another story, one written not in wages or work, but in cold, stone, and desperation. Nightfall in 1860 did not bring rest for everyone. For the wealthy, it meant retreating into parlors with heavy curtains, warm fires, and brandy in hand. But for the poor, the dark meant wandering the frozen streets in search of shelter, or curling into doorways with nothing but rags between their bones and the biting air. Along Whitechapel and Southwark, alleyways became graveyards of the living. Men wrapped themselves in burlap sacks, women clutched thin shawls, and children huddled together on frost-crusted steps. The gas lamps gave off halos of weak, trembling light, but they offered no heat. Imagine the silence broken only by a soft cough, the shuffle of bare feet, or the moan of a hungry stomach echoing against brick walls glazed in ice. Workhouses loomed as both refuge and prison. Their doors admitted only those who surrendered freedom for survival. Inside, food was thin gruel, beds were hard planks, and dignity was stripped away alongside clothing. Yet, for many, the choice was cruelly simple: the shame of the workhouse or the certainty of the street's deadly cold. Families often split at the door, men in one wing, women and children in another. Can you picture the heartbreak of a father watching his child taken from his arms at the threshold, unsure if he'd see them again in the morning? Begging became a bitter chorus along the cobblestones. "A farthing, sir, just a farthing for bread." Some passers-by dropped coins. Others pulled their coats tighter and quickened steps. To give was charity. To withhold was survival of one's own. But behind every outstretched hand was the same truth. Coal cost more than many could spare, and food was never enough. The bridges over the Thames offered little comfort. Frost clung to stone railings. The river below glimmered with sheets of ice, and the wind cut across its span like a blade. Yet still, figures crouched there through the night, backs pressed to the stone, trying to shield themselves from the wind. The smell was a cruel mixture: coal smoke drifting from chimneys, horse dung frozen on the streets, and the sourness of human bodies unwashed, unprotected against winter. Children, the smallest and most vulnerable, bore the frost with haunting resilience. They scavenged scraps from tavern refuse, carried stolen bits of coal in pockets, or clutched bread crusts like treasures. Some sang in soft voices outside pubs, hoping a tune might earn a coin or a kind glance. Their laughter, when it came, was thin, sharp, the sound of survival dressed as joy. Yet amid this brutality, there were flickers of kindness. A woman sharing her shawl with another shivering beside her. A stranger slipping half a loaf into a beggar's hands. Neighbors crouching together for warmth, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, proving that even without coal or bread, human presence could stave off despair for a few more hours. But make no mistake, the streets were merciless. Many never woke after curling into alleys, their bodies stiff by dawn, claimed quietly by frost. Others stumbled to churches, hoping for sanctuary, where priests offered thin blankets and weak tea in exchange for hymns whispered with cracked voices. London's grandeur, the glowing halls, the tall spires, the echo of carriages, stood side by side with this hidden suffering. This was the cruel balance of the winter of 1860. Glittering warmth for the few, bone-deep cold for the many. And in the hush of night, the city's silence carried both the crackle of a rich man's fire and the frozen stillness of those who had none. Not every Londoner slept under bridges or wrapped themselves in burlap. For the middle class, the clerks, shopkeepers, teachers, and modest tradesmen, winter of 1860 carved out a different kind of trial. They had roofs, they had walls, but survival was no less a daily negotiation with scarcity. Inside their narrow terraced homes, fires burned smaller than usual. Coal was expensive, and every lump had to be rationed like gold. Families gathered in one room, usually the parlor or kitchen, shutting doors tightly to conserve heat. Bedrooms upstairs sat empty, their sheets stiff with frost, windows etched in lace-like patterns of ice. Children learned to sleep 3 to a bed, their breath pooling into tiny clouds above patched quilts. Meals shrank in size. Breakfast, once buttered bread with tea, became only porridge thinned with water. Dinners leaned heavily on potatoes, onions, or whatever root vegetables were cheap enough at market. Meat, when it appeared, was stretched across stews. bones boiled twice to draw out every ounce of flavor. Mothers grew skilled at illusions, thickening broth with stale bread, roasting carrots until their sweetness disguised the absence of beef. For fathers, pride became both shield and burden. To admit hardship risked losing face before neighbors or employers. Many dressed in coats carefully brushed to hide wear, boots polished to disguise cracks, and faces shaved clean despite cold water and numbed hands. At the counting house or shop, they carried themselves with dignity, even while their minds calculated how many days' worth of coal remained in the scuttle at home. Children noticed. They weren't immune to the cold seeping under doors or the growl of hunger in their bellies. Yet parents softened it with stories. Bedtime tales weren't just for wonder, they were distractions from frost and thin blankets. Fathers whispered legends of past winters endured, while mothers promised spring was near, their voices wrapping the children in warmth words alone could provide. The middle class bore another invisible weight, the fear of slipping downward. Every shivering night was haunted by the sight of beggars on the streets, reminders that one lost job, one failed shop, one missed rent payment could drag them into the same fate. Respectability was a fragile coat, threadbare in places, yet clung to desperately. Was there a greater terror than imagining one's children among those huddled in alleys, hands outstretched for a coin? Still, even here, resilience took root. Neighbors shared what they could, an extra scuttle of coal, a loaf of bread baked a little larger to spare a slice. In small parishes, middle-class families organized collections, donating clothes too tight for their own children, or pooling pennies for widows. Charity was not just kindness, it was insurance, a network woven to keep misfortune at bay, because everyone knew how thin the line truly was. The soundscape of these homes was modest but steady. The clink of spoons against enamel bowls, the faint crackle of a fire carefully coaxed to last, the shuffle of slippers across wood floors that creaked under frost. Each sound was ordinary, yet beneath it lay the unspoken triumph of making do, of keeping family, dignity, and warmth intact through another day of brutal cold. London's middle class survived that winter, not through abundance, but through caution, endurance, and a stubborn refusal to let the frost strip them of pride. They endured with thin soups, careful fires, and whispered reassurances, holding tight to the belief that spring would come, and with it, relief. In the grand homes of London's West End, winter looked different, but not as carefree as one might think. Behind tall brick facades and wrought iron gates, the wealthy retreated into drawing rooms warmed by coal fires that never seemed to go out. Heavy velvet drapes sealed out the drafts. Chandeliers glittered above polished tables, and servants bustled quietly to keep the rooms comfortable. On the surface, life appeared untouched by scarcity. But even here, the brutal winter of 1860 left its mark. Coal deliveries, once taken for granted, became erratic. Merchants raised prices, and even wealthy households found themselves negotiating with stubborn suppliers. The kitchens that usually overflowed with game and meats now relied more heavily on preserved goods and imported luxuries. A leg of lamb or a basket of fresh vegetables carried a new weight, not because the rich couldn't pay, but because supply lines strained under the cold. Dinner parties still flickered with candlelight and conversation, but the tone shifted. Guests wrapped themselves in furs while waiting for carriages, breath visible in the night air, as footmen struggled to keep horses steady on icy streets. Inside, the talk turned often to the weather, to the price of coal, and sometimes whispered to the growing unrest in the poorer quarters. Could frost and hunger ripple into something more dangerous? The upper class carried not just fur cloaks, but also a subtle unease. The contrast outside their carriages was impossible to ignore. As wheels rolled over frozen cobblestones, faces pressed close to windows revealed beggars huddled near gas lamps, mothers carrying children wrapped in rags, men stamping their feet in the snow for warmth. For some elites, pity stirred. For others, annoyance. But for all, it was a reminder that wealth alone could not erase the sight or the smell of a city suffering. Within these fine homes, warmth itself became a kind of display. To walk into a drawing room where multiple hearths blazed was not only comfort, it was a statement. We can still afford what others cannot. Guests lingered longer in such places, stretching evenings with music, laughter, and wine, savoring not only company but also the luxury of steady heat. Was it guilt or pride that made the fires roar brighter, the candles burn longer, as if to keep the cold realities outside at bay? For the children of the upper class, winter carried a dual nature. They skated on private ponds, bundled in fine wool, their laughter echoing across frosted gardens. Yet their tutors and governesses could not shield them completely from questions. Why did the street outside look so different? Why did so many people line up for coal? For them, the season planted quiet contrasts, an early glimpse into a divided city. And for the servants, the ones who kept coal buckets filled and boots cleaned of snow, life was caught between two worlds. They carried warmth to their employers while their own families shivered in East End tenements. A butler might oversee roaring fires all evening, then trudge home to a single candle and a struggling hearth. Their hands bore the soot of coal, their backs the weight of wood, but their hearts carried the sharp awareness of inequality. Yes, the wealthy survived the winter more comfortably than most, but even their security was fragile. Supply shortages, rising tensions, and the constant visibility of poverty at their gates reminded them that London's frost was not simply a weather pattern, it was a mirror held up to society itself. While the upper classes tucked themselves behind velvet drapes and blazing hearths, the workers of London met winter face to face. Down by the docks, men with raw hands and frostbitten ears unloaded barges of coal, timber, and grain. The work never stopped, even when the Thames iced along its edges. Each step on the frozen planks was a gamble slip, and you could be swallowed by the black, icy water before anyone reached you. The smell of coal dust mixed with brine hung heavy in the air. Men coughed as they hauled sacks on their shoulders, sweat freezing against their backs within minutes. Pay was meager, hours long, and the cold didn't earn them a single penny more, yet they pressed on. Hunger left no room for refusal. In the workshops of Whitechapel and Southwark, artisans bent over their trades with stiff fingers. Carpenters shaped wood with numb hands. Metal workers struck sparks that barely seemed to warm the air. And seamstresses hunched over needles in unheated rooms, breath curling in faint clouds as they stitched by lamplight. Every strike of the hammer, every push of the saw, was a fight against not just poverty, but the cold that crept through cracks in the walls. Street laborers suffered even more. Men pushed carts of coal or vegetables through snow-laden lanes. Boots, soaked and stiff, shoulders aching under the weight. Women carried baskets of washing or bundles of rags, skirts trailing in slush that froze hard as stone by nightfall. Children, too, were pressed into work selling matches, carrying water, sweeping snow from shop fronts, anything to bring a penny home. Their thin voices, calling out on street corners, seemed to vanish into the fog as quickly as they were spoken. The cold was merciless, but camaraderie softened its edge. At the docks, men shared nips of gin or hot tea from tin mugs, passing warmth from hand to hand. In workshops, laborers hummed songs or swapped stories to keep their minds from the ache in their bones. In market lanes, women paused to share scraps of bread or a rumor of coal arriving in the morning. The small kindnesses, though fleeting, were lifelines. And yet, tension always lurked. Wages barely stretched to cover bread, let alone coal. And strikes of frost brought the threat of strikes of another kind, labor unrest. Employers warned their men to stay quiet, to keep their heads down. But how long could silence hold when children shivered at home and bellies growled through the night? The winter pressed not only against skin, but against the patience of the working poor. As night fell, the workers trudged back through alleys lined with frost and shadow. Boots clattered against cobbles slick with ice, shoulders hunched, scarves stiff with frozen breath. Home was no palace, just one room for a family of 6, maybe 8. Damp walls, a single candle, a hearth that smoked more than it burned. Still, when they crossed the threshold, something shifted. A wife's smile, a child's laughter, a shared crust of bread, these were their warmth. So while London's wealthy measured their winter in inconvenience, the city's workers measured it in survival. Every shift at the docks, every stitch in a workshop, every cart pulled through icy streets was not just labor, it was life wrestled back, one frozen breath at a time. In the brutal winter of 1860, London's poorest children bore the cold as though it were stitched into their skin. They had no wool coats, no sturdy boots, often only thin rags wrapped around their feet and hands. Their faces were chapped raw, noses running, lips cracked and bleeding. And yet, every morning, they spilled onto the frozen streets because hunger left them no choice. Some carried trays of matches, calling out in weak voices along foggy alleys. Matches, matches for a penny. Their fingers, already numb, struggled to strike a flame when buyers demanded to test them. For many, a day's earnings might barely buy a crust of bread, and if no one bought, they returned home with nothing but frost in their bones. Others crouched at street corners with boxes of polish, offering to shine, boots for gentlemen who passed by. They knelt in the slush, hands blackened with soot, faces turned up hopefully, only to be kicked aside or ignored. A single coin was a triumph. A curse or a shove was more common. There were chimney boys too, wiry little figures shoved up narrow flues to scrape soot from chimneys. The soot clung to their skin, mixing with sweat and frost until their bodies reeked of ash. When they emerged, coughing, blinking against the bitter air, it was back to the next chimney, the next fire, the next crawl. Others scavenged along the frozen Thames. They searched the icy banks for scraps of coal fallen from barges, digging with bare hands into the snow. Some found bits of rope, rags or wood, anything to sell or burn. Their eyes, wide with desperation, scanned every patch of ground like hunters in a barren wilderness. And then there were the beggars, children no older than 6 or 7, who huddled outside taverns or market stalls, hands cupped, voices thin. They asked for bread, for coal, sometimes only for warmth. Many Londoners passed without looking. A few tossed coins, more to ease their conscience than to feed the child. The lucky ones carried home a heel of bread or a single lump of coal like treasure. Yet, in all this bleakness, children still found ways to hold on to scraps of joy. A snowfall could spark laughter. They chased flakes with open mouths, or skated in shoes too big on frozen puddles, their giggles echoing briefly before vanishing into the fog. They played games with sticks, stones, or chalk scratched on walls, fleeting sparks of childhood in a city that demanded adulthood far too soon. At night, when they returned to cold rooms or damp cellars, they curled into piles with siblings for warmth. Their bodies pressed together, they whispered stories, hummed songs, or simply listened to the wind. In their closeness, they built a shield against despair. For them, survival was not just about food or coal, it was about clinging to each other, refusing to let winter strip them of every last scrap of hope. The winter of 1860 was merciless. But if you looked closely at these children, the match girl, the bootblack, the chimney boy, you would see not just misery, but endurance. Fragile bodies carrying fierce spirits, shivering but unbroken, teaching London a truth it often tried to forget, that even in its coldest nights, life refused to surrender. In the cruelest winters, when even the Thames threatened to lock itself in ice, it was often the churches that became lifelines. Their bells did more than call to prayer. They called the desperate, the cold, and the hungry. Families trudged through snow with heads bowed, clutching children close, drawn to the faint promise of warmth behind stone walls. Inside, the air was only marginally warmer, but the sense of refuge mattered. Candles flickered against vaulted ceilings, their glow softening faces worn by frost. Priests spoke of endurance, of faith, of God's mercy in times of suffering. Yet the sermons were not always enough. What people needed most was bread, broth, and coal. So in some parishes, charitable kitchens came alive. Large cauldrons were set upon iron stoves, filled with thin soup made from bones, barley, and turnips. Volunteers ladled steaming portions into battered bowls, the aroma of broth rising like a blessing. For many, this was the only hot meal of the week. Mothers lifted spoons to children's lips as if offering medicine, watching their little faces soften with the first swallow. Elsewhere, wealthy Londoners, sometimes moved by pity, sometimes by duty-funded coal tickets or bread tokens distributed through parish offices. A slip of paper meant a loaf at the baker's, or a small sack of coal at the yard. It was not generosity enough to cure the city's hunger, but for those who received it, it was survival. Imagine the relief of carrying home a bundle of coal through fog, knowing the hearth would glow for just one more night. Charity also spilled into the streets. Soup kitchens opened near markets, serving thin but hot gruel to long lines of laborers and children. Philanthropic societies sent women with baskets of bread and shawls into alleys, placing them in the hands of those too proud to beg. Sometimes these acts were small, unnoticed by most. But to a freezing family in Whitechapel, a single loaf could mean the difference between hope and despair. And yet, even in kindness, inequality lingered. The soup was often watery, the bread stale, the coal portion meager. The wealthy gave just enough to soothe their consciences, not enough to alter the tide of misery. Still, the poor came because something, however little, was better than nothing. But here's the striking thing. The gatherings themselves became a kind of community. People waiting in soup lines swapped stories, shared news of work or sickness, even laughed at small jokes to keep the cold at bay. Children played tag in the queue, their thin boots sliding over icy cobbles, while parents whispered advice on stretching rations or surviving another week. In those humble corners, the church basement, the market soup stall, the parish coal shed, London's resilience lived. Not in grand halls or wealthy parlors, but in bowls of broth, ladled by tired hands, in candles lit against the dark, in neighbors offering scraps of warmth when the city itself felt frozen stiff. The brutal winter of 1860 revealed the stark divide between rich and poor, but it also revealed something else: the stubborn human impulse to share, however little there was. In a season when frost could strip the breath from your lungs, compassion became a kind of fire. While mothers in Whitechapel huddled with their children around dying embers, the wealthiest addresses of London glowed with another kind of fire. Behind the high doors of Mayfair and Belgravia, the winter of 1860 looked almost like a fairy tale. Carriages arrived at glittering townhouses, wheels crunching over the same snow that starved families had trudged through earlier that day. Footmen in livery swept steps clear of frost, holding lanterns aloft as fur-clad ladies and gentlemen stepped out into pools of golden light. Inside, chandeliers burned with hundreds of candles. Crystal glasses sparkled. Banquet tables sagged beneath roasted pheasants, joints of beef, puddings, and wines imported from France. The smell of cinnamon, clove, and roasting meats wafted through hallways, a cruel contrast to the watery broth simmering in soup kitchens only streets away. Musicians tuned violins, and the first notes of waltzes drifted through heated rooms, where couples spun across polished floors. It wasn't that the wealthy were unaware of the cold outside. Many even donated a portion of their fortune to charity. But within those walls, winter became an aesthetic backdrop, a kind of theatrical setting for romance and conversation. Snow outside? That was a decoration viewed from frost-laced windows, not a death sentence creeping through the floorboards. Ladies wore gowns of velvet and silk, their colors bold against the pale gloom of the streets beyond. Men toasted the season with brandy, discussing politics and trade while fireplaces roared at their backs. Their boots never slipped on icy cobbles, their breath never steamed in their own sitting rooms. Servants kept the coal bins full, the lamps trimmed, the glasses polished, and yet, even in the laughter of ballrooms and the glitter of chandeliers, there were whispers. Some aristocrats admitted, over champagne, that the frost had driven prices of coal sky high, cutting into even their well-lined purses. Others fretted about uprisings. What if the hungry poor turned their eyes toward the mansions of Mayfair? What if frost and famine ignited not just hearths but tempers? The contrast could not have been sharper. A mile away, a father might be breaking apart furniture to feed the fire for one more night. Here, a hostess complained that her roses wilted in the cold. Outside, children scraped frost from windows to glimpse a gray world. Inside, children of privilege skated across indoor ballrooms, their laughter echoing under painted ceilings. The winter of 1860 laid bare not only the brittleness of coal and food, but the brittleness of society itself. For every diamond glinting in candlelight, there was a starving gaze reflected in the fog outside. London, in that season, was one city split into two winters, one of velvet and banquets, and one of frost and hunger. And yet the two worlds were bound together. The coal that glowed in Mayfair parlors was mined by men who froze on their way home. The bread cut in Belgravia kitchens came from bakeries where children queued for stale crumbs. Luxury and deprivation shared the same streets, the same weather, the same fog-choked air. The snow did not care about status. It fell on palaces and slums alike, coating both in the same relentless white. The difference lay only in how much fire, food, and fortune one had to fight it off. Illness was the silent guest that slipped into every London home during the brutal winter of 1860. The frost did not just crack roofs or stiffen rivers, it weakened lungs, wore down immune systems, and made even the smallest cough a threat. In the crowded tenements of East London, where families huddled together for warmth, sickness spread faster than any coal fire could burn. Children were the first to suffer. The damp air seeped into their bones, and what began as a sniffle often grew into bronchitis or pneumonia. Mothers laid gentle hands against their children's foreheads, hoping for warmth from fever, dreading the reality it revealed. A wheeze in the night carried more fear than the howl of the wind. Every rattle of breath seemed to echo louder than the church bells outside. Doctors, when they could be found, prescribed rest and warmth, luxuries many could not afford. Coal was scarce, medicine expensive, and food too thin to build strength. Some families turned to home remedies, simmering onion or mustard poultices, or rubbing camphor on chests. Others relied on sheer endurance, wrapping their children in every scrap of cloth they owned, whispering prayers into the smoky air. But disease was not limited to the poor. Even in wealthy homes, influenza crept in, carried by servants who worked all day in freezing markets before returning to polished halls. For the rich, recovery was more likely. Plenty of coal, meat, and wine kept their strength intact. Still, the fear was universal. For all their fortune, no one could buy immunity from winter's bite. The overcrowded workhouses became breeding grounds. Coughs echoed through long, damp corridors, and the smell of sickness mingled with coal smoke and unwashed linen. Officials tried to impose order, rationing blankets, dividing the sick from the well, but in such close quarters, contagion was unavoidable. Death records swelled with the names of infants, the elderly, and laborers, whose bodies had simply given out under the weight of hunger and cold. Churches held funerals daily, their bells tolling through fog so thick it seemed to muffle even grief. Coffins were lowered into frozen ground, while mourners stamped their feet against the frost, their breaths rising in pale clouds of sorrow. For every grave dug, another family sat at home, watching a loved one weaken, fearing their turn would be next. And yet, amid this despair, Londoners still fought back with resilience. Neighbors shared scraps of broth, carried water for the sick, or watched over children when parents fell ill. Nurses and volunteers walked the frozen streets, lanterns swinging, carrying baskets of bread or bottles of gin meant to warm aching bodies. These acts did not cure disease, But they proved something else, that even when survival seemed cruel, compassion survived the cold. The winter of 1860 was not only remembered for its frost and hunger, but also for the shadows of illness it cast across the city. The cold pressed into lungs, sickness thrived in damp air, and lives were lost not to the snow itself, but to the weakness it carved into human flesh. Still, every breath taken in that frozen city was a form of defiance. Each cough endured, each fever survived, was another small victory against a season that seemed determined to break them. London lived through the winter not only with coal and bread, but with a stubborn will to keep breathing, no matter how heavy the air. When the coal bins were empty and the cupboards bare, many Londoners turned to the only places that still offered light and a sense of refuge: the churches. In December of 1860, their tall stone walls, usually drafty and cold, became sanctuaries where candles burned longer than hearths, and where hymns carried warmth that no fire could provide. Parish halls hosted gatherings not of celebration, but of survival. Families sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, not because of devotion alone, but because being near others gave comfort. The sound of voices lifted in prayer was as much about asking for bread and coal as it was about seeking divine mercy. "Give us this day our daily bread" became painfully literal. Charitable organizations and small societies sprang into action. The Salvation Army had not yet been founded. It would come a few years later, but London already had countless church-based charities, soup kitchens, and relief committees. Volunteers ladled out thin broths into tin cups, steam rising like hope in the fog-choked air. The soup was watery, often little more than bones boiled with root vegetables, but for those who had eaten nothing all day, it tasted like salvation itself. Wealthy benefactors made donations too, though not always out of compassion. Some gave publicly to polish their reputation, their names printed in broadsheets as examples of noble generosity. Others quietly sent sacks of coal or crates of bread to parishes in poorer districts, knowing their gifts might prevent riots from breaking out when hunger pressed too hard. Whatever the motive, the result was the same small embers of relief scattered across a freezing city. Children were often at the heart of these efforts. Sunday schools distributed bread rolls and sometimes even hot cocoa, making sure little stomachs were filled if only for a day. Ministers reminded congregations that charity was not optional, but commanded that a loaf shared, a blanket donated, or a coin spared could mean the difference between life and death. For once, sermons carried weight not just for souls, but for survival. Still, charity had its limits. Relief lines stretched far, and supplies ran out quickly. Mothers clutching children sometimes arrived too late, finding empty pots and doors shuttered. The disappointment cut deeper than the frost itself. In those moments, neighbors often stepped in where institutions failed, slipping a potato into another's basket, or quietly sharing a scrap of coal. These small, unrecorded acts built an invisible web of survival across the city. The church bells rang on through the fog, sometimes for funerals, sometimes for gatherings of prayer. Their sound threaded through the frozen streets, reminding Londoners that, though the city seemed swallowed by cold, faith and fellowship had not been extinguished. In the end, it wasn't only the sermons that kept people alive, it was the simple reality of being together, of knowing they were not facing the winter alone. By the close of December, Churches and charities stood as fragile lighthouses in the blizzard of hardship. They could not banish the frost, but they kept despair at bay long enough for families to push forward, day after day, prayer after prayer, cup of soup after cup of soup. When night fell on London during that brutal winter of 1860, the city did not sleep, it simply worked in the dark. Factories along the Thames and in the East End churned on, their windows glowing faintly against the fog, the sound of machinery muffled by frost. Inside, men and women bent over looms, presses, and anvils, their breaths hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The cold crept in even through the thick brick walls. Workers wrapped themselves in scarves and worn coats as they hammered iron, stitched leather, or pressed fabric. Fingers cracked from the frost and stiffened against tools, yet the rhythm of work could not stop. If they left their posts, wages vanished, and with wages went coal, bread, and survival. Child labor was everywhere. Boys no older than 10 hauled buckets of coal to keep the machines alive, while girls crouched low to sweep the frost from factory floors. Their cheeks were raw, their hands red and swollen, but their eyes were fixed on overseers who made sure not a second was wasted. Imagine being that small, standing in the roar of machines, your body shivering not from fear, but from the sheer cold that no wool could fend off. Night shifts were the harshest. Workers trudged through snow-choked alleys before dawn, boots scraping against frozen cobblestones, scarves pulled high to block the wind. The city was eerily still, except for their steady footsteps and the occasional rattle of a cart. At factory gates, lanterns swung in the fog, glowing like tired eyes. The shift whistle cut through the night, sharp as the wind, calling them inside. Even in the poorest workshops, there was a strange intimacy in these hours. People leaned close to machines, not just for the work, but for the faint heat they gave off. Iron presses and steam pipes became makeshift hearths, radiating warmth that workers stole in snatches when overseers weren't watching. A hand pressed against hot metal, a face leaned toward a steam vent. These were stolen luxuries, tiny rebellions against the frost. The smell of industry mixed with winter air, coal dust, oil, damp wool, and faint smoke from pipes or candles. It clung to clothing and hair, followed men and women home, and turned their very bodies into testaments of survival. Some sang softly while they worked, their voices trembling in the cold, weaving old folk songs with the hiss of steam and the strike of hammers. When the shifts ended, workers spilled back into the streets. Their wages were light in hand, but heavier than hope itself. Some carried home bread or a small sack of coal bought on the way. Others stopped briefly at taverns, trading a few pennies for weak ale, letting the warmth of laughter, even short-lived, chase the cold from their bones. And then they went home to dark rooms, thin stews, and families waiting with blankets. London in 1860 was not only a city of frost and hunger, it was a city of labor that refused to stop moving, even when the snow piled high and the wind cut sharper than knives. Factories roared because people endured, and people endured because they had no choice. By the time February arrived, Londoners no longer spoke of the cold as something extraordinary. It had become the unshakable rhythm of daily life, a presence as steady as the fog and as heavy as the frost that clung to rooftops. The city had adjusted, if survival could be called an adjustment. Each morning began with the same ritual, a breath of air so sharp it cut down the throat, the sound of boots crunching on ice-hardened streets, and the bitter realization that another day of struggle lay ahead. The coal shortage had reached its cruelest point. Families who once debated how many shillings to spend on bread versus meat now argued over whether they could afford even a small basket of coal. Dealers were besieged at dawn, their shops surrounded by crowds of shivering men and women, each hoping to claim a sack before the supply ran out. Prices soared higher than most workers' wages could match. Some families pooled coins with neighbors, buying just enough to share the embers. Others resorted to burning scraps of wood, broken furniture, even old shoes, anything that could smolder long enough to take the edge off the night. Imagine the sight. Rows of chimneys that once belched steady smoke now sat silent, capped in frost, signaling that whole blocks of homes were without fire. The skyline itself revealed the desperation patches of smoke here and there, but vast stretches of cold rooftops standing mute against the gray February sky. Inside those houses, the silence was broken only by coughing, by whispers of parents soothing children, by the restless shuffle of blankets being pulled tighter. Food did not come easily either. The markets were starved of supply. Vegetables were shriveled, fish frozen solid. Bread made from flour stretched with anything bakers could mix in sawdust, bran, even ground peas. Housewives lined up in the cold for hours, hoping to bring home something, anything, to put in the pot. Thin stews simmered in cracked kettles, their watery broth filling the air with a scent that was less about nourishment than about survival. And yet even those weak meals were a blessing. Many went without. The streets themselves told the story of this brutal February. Horses slipped on the ice, carts skidded sideways, and men cursed into the frozen wind as they tried to push wagons loaded with coal or timber. Icicles dripped from eaves, then froze again into jagged spears. Gas lamps flickered weakly through veils of fog, casting halos on cobblestones polished slick with ice. The city that prided itself on constant movement had slowed to a crawl. Everything was slower work, travel, speech itself, as if every word had to be warmed before leaving the mouth. But life did not stop, because it could not. Children still trudged to school wrapped in shawls and scarves, their cheeks stung red. Men still went to docks and factories, though the work was thinner than ever. Women still managed homes, scraping together meals and tending to fires that barely flickered. London endured not by choice, but by necessity. And yet, in the midst of this endurance, remarkable scenes unfolded. Neighbors who barely spoke before now shared coal, huddled together in one home when another ran out of fuel. Churches opened their doors at night, laying straw on the floors for the poor to sleep upon, the glow of candles offering both warmth and dignity to those who had none. Quakers and charitable groups handed out bowls of soup to long lines of the destitute, their efforts small compared to the need but monumental to the lives saved. At night, the city transformed into something almost unearthly. The fog thickened, muffling sound, swallowing whole buildings until only faint lantern light glimmered. Snow drifted down in soft spirals, blanketing the streets in silver silence. Those who ventured out moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled by snow, their breath rising in pale clouds that vanished almost instantly into the mist. And behind the windows of soot-darkened houses, families clung to one another, watching the glow of a dying fire, praying it would last until morning. The newspapers recorded the toll with grim regularity. Deaths from exposure, from pneumonia, from hunger. Corpses were carried out in the early hours, carts creaking through narrow lanes as neighbors averted their eyes. Yet alongside these grim accounts were stories of survival of a mother who walked miles to find a loaf of bread, of a boy who gathered wood scraps from construction sites to warm his siblings, of communities that refused to let their weakest perish without a fight. By mid-February, the Thames itself was fringed with ice. Barges groaned in its grip, timbers creaking against the frozen edges. On the bridges, Londoners leaned over to stare at the rare spectacle ice floes, drifting sluggishly in the current, carrying twigs, refuse, and the occasional bird perched like a traveler on an unwilling raft. The river, usually the lifeblood of the city, seemed subdued, its voice hushed beneath a heavy lid of winter. Inside the wealthier homes, the cold was easier to manage, but not entirely absent. Thick velvet curtains were drawn across windows, coal piled high in cellars, and kitchens kept busy with roasts and puddings. But even there, the chill seeped in through cracks, frosting the glass and chilling rooms at the edges. And for every mansion glowing with warmth, there were 100 tenements where families slept side by side, like stacked firewood, their combined body heat the only shield against the night. The soundscape of February was unlike any other. The crackle of coal, rare but cherished. The soft hiss of a kettle trying to boil. The muffled coughing of neighbors through thin walls. And beyond that, the city's muted rhythm, the shuffle of boots on snow, the faint ring of church bells softened by fog, the lonely cry of a watchman calling the hour into the frozen air. Together, these sounds formed a lullaby of survival, a quiet anthem to endurance. And what of hope? Hope lingered, though faint. Each morning, people looked to the sky, searching for a change. Would the wind shift? Would the frost relent? They spoke of rumors, warmer days ahead, ships loaded with coal making their way upriver, markets soon to be filled with food again. Rumors were fuel in themselves, stories that kept people moving forward when their bodies were too tired to do so alone. Still, February dragged on, and each night ended the same way. Families gathering close to the fire, such as it was. Children drifting into sleep beneath patched blankets. Parents whispering reassurances they themselves did not believe. The city, wrapped in snow and silence, endured because there was no alternative. London's heartbeat slowed, but never stopped. This was the brutal winter of 1,860 coal shortages, freezing streets, hunger at the door. And yet within that hardship, Londoners revealed a truth. That survival is not just about warmth or food, but about the expert, small, unyielding acts of care that bind people together when the world turns hostile. February bore down on them like an iron weight. But they did not collapse. They bent, they shivered, they suffered, but they endured. As February deepened, London seemed to settle into a rhythm of endurance. It was not the rhythm of prosperity or progress, but of sheer survival. The days stretched on with the same gray light, the same aching cold, the same sound of boots crunching on snow-hardened cobblestones. The air carried a brittle sharpness that seemed to pierce even through layers of wool, and every breath felt like a small battle. Coal, or rather the lack of it, dominated every conversation. Men lined up outside dealers' yards before dawn, stamping their feet against the frozen ground. watching their own breath rise in clouds. They waited for carts to arrive, for sacks to be unloaded, for a chance to buy even a small measure before supplies were gone. And when the sacks were empty and the gates closed, those left empty-handed trudged home in silence, knowing their families would face another night in the cold. The poorest households had already stripped their homes of anything combustible. Furniture, broken floorboards, even old crates scavenged from markets were fed into grates that barely gave off more than a whisper of heat. The smell of burning paint and resin-filled narrow alleys, mingling with the ever-present coal smoke from households lucky enough to have secured a sack or two. The city stank of desperation. Children felt the weight of this winter most acutely. Their hands cracked and reddened, their shoes worn thin, their faces drawn with hunger. Yet, somehow, they still found sparks of joy. They pressed fingers against frost-covered windows, marveling at the crystalline patterns etched overnight. They caught snowflakes on their tongues, their laughter rising briefly above the silence of frozen streets. In these fleeting moments, London seemed almost magical, as if the snow had turned the city into a silver kingdom. But behind the laughter was a sharper truth. When play ended, hunger and cold returned with cruel swiftness. Work, too, was slowed to a crawl. Carriages skidded on icy streets, delaying deliveries. Barges struggled along the Thames, its surface fringed with ice. Factories stood idle when coal ran out, leaving men and women jobless at the very moment they most needed wages. The silence of closed workshops echoed like a warning bell through working-class neighborhoods. Breadwinners returned home with empty hands, faces drawn tight with shame and worry. Markets became scenes of quiet desperation. Bread was stretched thinner and thinner. Flour padded with whatever filler could be found. Vegetables were limp, their skins wrinkled and gray from frost. Fishmongers hacked at blocks of ice, encasing their catch, the smell of brine mingling with the cold air. Women clutched baskets with white-knuckled hands, bargaining fiercely for scraps, counting coins again and again, to see if they could afford even a meager portion. And yet, amid this bleakness, acts of kindness multiplied. Churches opened their doors, laying straw across stone floors so the homeless could find a night of shelter. Soup kitchens ladled thin broth into tin cups, each steaming portion a miracle to those whose stomachs ached with emptiness. Neighbors shared what little they had, a half loaf of bread, a handful of coal. A blanket passed from one household to another. These small gestures, repeated across the city, kept despair from overwhelming the human spirit. The newspapers painted a grim picture, tallying the dead in stark numbers. Exposure claimed the lives of the elderly, of infants, of those without kin to watch over them. Pneumonia spread quickly through damp, unheated rooms. Carts moved through alleys at dawn, carrying away the bodies of those who had succumbed in the night. And yet, alongside the death notices, were stories of extraordinary endurance. A mother who walked miles through snow to find bread. A dock worker who gave his wages to a widow with children. A boy who scavenged wood scraps to keep his siblings alive. These stories traveled by word of mouth as much as by print, offering Londoners proof that compassion survived even in the coldest days. Nightfall turned the city into a world of muted shadows. Fog rolled thick through narrow streets, wrapping lampposts in halos of trembling gold. Icicles hung like glass daggers from rooftops, glinting faintly in the dim light. The crunch of boots on snow, the creak of shutters in the wind, the distant call of a watchman, these were the sounds of London at night in February 1860. And beneath those sounds was a silence so deep it seemed to press against the skin, a silence broken only by the occasional cry of a hungry child or the muffled cough of the sick. Inside the homes that still had fuel, the hearth was more than warmth, it was a shrine. Families gathered close, wrapping themselves in layers of patched wool and thin quilts. Mothers stirred thin stews, coaxing flavor from scraps. Fathers tended the fire, shifting coals carefully to make the heat last. Children pressed close, their cheeks glowing in the faint firelight, drifting into uneasy sleep while parents whispered words of reassurance they hardly believed themselves. The smell of coal smoke, damp wool, and thin broth filled these rooms, a layered aroma that spoke of survival more than comfort. Every breath was grounding, reminding each family that, despite the hunger and the cold, they were still alive, still together. Even the smallest gestures, a hand smoothing a blanket, a father mending a shoe, a child offering a crust of bread to a sibling, became acts of resistance against the winter's cruelty. By late February, rumors of relief began to stir. Whispers spread that barges laden with coal were making their way upriver, that shipments of food were arriving at the docks. These stories, whether true or not, gave people something to cling to. Hope became as essential as bread, fueling the will to endure another night, another morning, another day in a city held hostage by winter. Yet the thaw did not come quickly. The Thames remained fringed with ice, its currents muffled beneath a frozen crust. Bridges creaked under the weight of frost. Horses stumbled, carts slid, and men cursed into the bitter wind. Londoners scanned the sky daily for a change, but the gray ceiling of clouds persisted, pressing down like a lid. And so February dragged on, each day blending into the next, each night a test of endurance. But the people of London, hardened by weeks of suffering, found a kind of grim strength in the routine. They bent but did not break. They shivered, but they endured. And as February drew toward its end, a subtle shift began, barely noticeable at first, but real. A hint of softness in the air, a drip of water where ice had held fast. The promise, however faint, that winter's grip might soon begin to loosen. The brutal winter of 1860 was not over, but Londoners began to feel the faint stirrings of change. And for those who had survived this far, even the smallest sign of thaw was enough to rekindle hope. By March of 1860, London finally began to breathe again. The ice that had gripped the Thames loosened its hold, breaking into jagged plates that drifted slowly downstream. The streets, once buried beneath layers of frost and snow, turned slick with meltwater, cobblestones shining under a pale spring sun that broke through the clouds at last. It was not sudden, and it was not without hardship. Melting ice meant flooding in alleys and cellars. Sickness still lurked in damp rooms, and hunger was not banished overnight. But for the first time in months, Londoners felt the bite of winter ease just slightly from their shoulders. Coal carts moved more freely, wagons rattling along thawed roads, sacks stacked higher than they had been in weeks. The prices remained steep, but the sight of black dust spilling once again across the markets gave hope. Fishmongers set out fresher catches, vegetables appeared in small piles, and the smell of bread baking in corner shops grew stronger each day. Life fragile and stubborn, was returning. Children, who had grown pale and thin through the bitterest weeks, ventured into streets now damp with thaw. They splashed in puddles, their laughter echoing against walls that only weeks before had carried the sound of coughing and weeping. Their cheeks flushed with new energy, their games a sign that spring, however modest, was on its way. Parents watched them with quiet relief, their own hearts thawing with every sound of joy. The city itself bore scars. Some families had not survived. Empty chairs at tables, shuttered windows, and the silent absence of neighbors were reminders of what the frost had taken. Yet even in grief, Londoners found strength. Churches rang their bells again, markets grew louder, and factories reopened with the crackle of fires once more burning in their furnaces. The city, bruised and battered, had endured. When people looked back at that winter, they did not remember only the hunger or the cold. They remembered the small mercies that had carried them through. A neighbor sharing a piece of coal, a mother's whispered lullaby, a stranger's hand extended in kindness. The brutal winter of 1860 had tested the heart of London, and in its quiet perseverance, the city discovered its greatest strength, its people. And so, as the days grew longer and the ice melted into memory, London carried forward not just the scars of hardship, but also the enduring truth that warmth can be found even in the harshest frost, and hope can be kindled even in the darkest nights. And that, my friends, is where we close tonight's story. From the frozen streets and coal shortages of a winter long past, to the resilience of families who endured together, this chapter of history reminds us that even in the coldest times, human care and connection create the strongest fire. Thank you so much for staying with me through this journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. And now, I wish you peace, comfort, and rest. May your night be warm, your dreams gentle, and your heart steady. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.